Hello, my name is Morgan, and today I'm going to be reviewing Finwise App.io. This is supposedly a Mint competitor. I've been reviewing the app for a little more than a week at this point. I think I have a pretty good sense for what they're good at, and also a pretty good sense of where they don't quite work properly, and whether or not I would recommend them as an application for budgeting. So, without further ado, let's lean in. Signing up for Finwise is pretty straightforward. Name, email address, and password. You can get started by answering 3 quick questions. They are curious whether you are a beginner, intermediate, or advanced. I'm not exactly sure which, but I always recommend going for beginner when you're signing up for applications because they will give you the most help at using the application in the way that they think is best. Why are you interested in Finwise? Choose all of the options that apply to you. Choose your currency. And I highly recommend always doing the startup guide because, again, they'll teach you how to use the app in the way that they think is best. As with most category-based budgeting systems, Finwise asks you to come up with a list of categories you want to divide your budget into. In general, I don't have a use for many of these categories, but the fact that they've included them from the very beginning indicates that they think that they're useful. I'm going to go ahead and just hit continue. From here, you can add all of the accounts you use for spending and financial planning. I'm only going to add my spending accounts because I'm more curious about the budgeting side of things. Once you've added all of your accounts, then you can continue to the rest of onboarding. As with most category-based budgeting apps, they ask you to determine how much you plan to spend in each category. I am assuming these are monthly numbers. The problem is that it's really difficult to understand how to move money around before I understand how the budgeting system works. Eventually, I recommend you just click continue because you can change this later. In order to help with financial planning, you can give it information about when you were born, your monthly income and how much it increases, your monthly expenses and how often they increase, in order to help it explain to you how quickly you can retire and how your financial planning is going. I found this page very confusing because it's combining a number of problems together. For example, how old I am and how much I spend each year is interesting to know in terms of retirement, but adding a future one-off expense and having only one of them is a very strange thing. Maybe this is to help you understand how the system works before you really get into it, but it felt like these two sections were stapled together instead of a coherent concept. I'm going to skip this for now. You will initially land on the overview page, where Finwise will explain to you how it thinks you're doing with your finances for the month, as well as your net worth and assets and liabilities. Currently, Finwise says that I am over budget by $4,154 for the month. Let's see if we can understand how Finwise arrived at that number and whether or not we think that it's accurate. Looking at the budgeting page, we immediately arrive sorted by the Available tab. I'm going to sort by actual instead to get a sense of how much I've spent in each category. The mortgage is currently listed at the top, which is definitely my largest expense, but as we go through, we have a bunch of work to do in order to understand exactly how much was spent on which thing. I can click on each of these categories to get more information and show a list of transactions in that category. Looking at each of these categories and understanding what's inside of it requires clicking on it and then seeing the transactions inside. Finwise has done a pretty good job, but there are notable exceptions. For example, this check that I wrote for my property taxes was indicated to be bank charges and fees. I can go ahead and change that. But what this means is that I no longer trust all of these categories, and I'm going to have to review pretty much every transaction that's come through every month. That's a lot of work, considering that it was supposed to automatically categorize my transactions for me. When I scroll down to the bottom, I finally understand why Finwise thinks I'm over budget for the month. I had expected to make $13,000 this month, but I've only made $7,000 this month. I get paid bi-monthly, which means that I won't receive my second paycheck for November until the end of the month. While I've budgeted this money, and I've expected to get paid for it, Finwise uses the actual amount that has come through in order to calculate whether or not I'm on or not on budget. This means that for the first 14 days of the month, I will be extremely over budget, and I will only be accurately on budget for 1 day of the month. This does not seem very useful to me. Unfortunately, I don't believe that there is any way to solve this problem. The list of transactions that exist are the only transactions that can be applied to November. Even if I were to move last month's transactions over for the first 14 days of the month, I would still be inaccurately budgeting. Some of the other pages in Finwise are interesting. Let's take a look at the Insights page. When I look at the Insights page, it's trying to give me a general sense of my income versus my expenses on a monthly basis. When I look at the income for July, I see that a large transaction has happened that I put to cover some future expenses. And then you see that I spent those expenses in September. These things cancel themselves out in my mind, but I'd be much more interested in having them be ignorable and not even show up on the Insights page instead. Similarly, it looks like I have not made nearly enough money this month when actually I will be fairly flush in October. Overall, this page is not very useful to me, and there's nothing that I can click on in order to drill down for more information. Let's take a look at the Transactions page. One of the things that I ran into on the Transactions page at first is when I scrolled all the way to the bottom, I thought there were no more transactions. There's no indication that more transactions are coming. And so I thought that I was only able to see the transactions for this last month. It turns out all I have to do is scroll down to the bottom, and then more transactions will be loaded. That said, I'm only able to load transactions back through August, and anything before that doesn't show up. This is at odds with the Insights page where I was able to see data all the way back to July. There are a number of concepts that Finwise has. For example, this is listed as a transfer. I don't know what that actually means, and I can't even hover over it in order to figure it out. Perhaps transfers affect my budget, perhaps they don't. Perhaps transfers affect my insights, perhaps they don't. But I don't have a whole lot of information to understand immediately whether or not I can change that or should. Let's take a look at the help page. This is a fairly simple page with a number of accordions, and each accordion has a set of videos inside of it. Videos are great for understanding how to use user interfaces, but they're terrible as a reference document. For example, all of the information inside of these videos is locked up inside the video. I can't search for them, I can't reference them, and if I don't have speakers connected or it's late at night, I don't necessarily want to watch a whole video. Having a combination of the two is much more valuable to me. Much like the Insights page, the cash flow page doesn't really provide a whole lot of information as to what's happening. It seems like it's a combination of the Insights page and the Transactions page. And you can see here in July, I have a cash flow where I've earned a bunch of money, and then in September, I spent a bunch of money. Overall, things average out, but I'm not sure how useful this page is. Again, I can scroll to the bottom, and I can get additional transactions to review, but what to do about them, I'm not sure. Why I would want to filter on this page instead of the Transactions page, I'm also not sure. Also, I've got a single graph that says cash flow, and it's not like I have income or expenses. Nothing seems to be broken down. I'm not sure about the utility of this page either. The Plans page is currently in beta. It is much more about financial planning, where they talk about if you assume a 4% growth rate or a financial plan over time, that you would end up understanding whether or not you would be able to retire. Again, I focused mostly on budgeting, so I don't have any insight as to the effectiveness or utility of this page. The last two pages that are listed here are in development, reporting, and goals. I am curious to see if they would solve some of the problems that I have with the app, but honestly, I don't know that they would provide the kind of value that I'm looking for. In conclusion, I found Finwise to be a decently polished app with a few strange UI choices. In general, everything that I clicked on worked really well. Everything was snappy. The user interface seemed to have been well thought out. But the problems that I ran into in terms of whether or not my budget was functional and whether or not my paychecks came in at the right time were definite deal breakers for me. If I can't plan my budget, and if Finwise says that I'm $4,000 over for the month, but in fact I'm actually going to be almost $4,000 under for the month, that feels like a huge miss to me. There are a few minor user interface tweaks that I would make. The Yodely and plaid handoff is a little weird, but overall, I feel like it's a decent start. I'm curious whether the financial planning aspects of the app would make up for some of the budgeting aspects. But since I feel that budgeting is such a fundamental requirement to do financial planning, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to focus on the financial planning side of things without the budget. Overall, I recommend probably finding a different app. Finwise is a nice start. It has some pretty aspects to it, but I would probably look somewhere else.